Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's lecture, which is being very kindly delivered by Simon Kane, who is Director of Public and Cultural Engagement here at UCL. So he's a very close colleague now. My name is May Kassar, and these lectures are held in memory of Dr. Nigel Seeley, who was visiting professor with the UCL Institute for Sustainable Heritage. For many years, head of conservation at the Institute of Archaeology, also here at UCL. My teacher and also my mentor, and very supportive of the Institute for Sustainable Heritage when it was set up, until, sadly, his untimely death, I think over a decade ago now. And we've been holding these lectures in his name. He would have enjoyed this evening. He was exciting, generous with his time, and very, very inventive. But let's talk about Simon. Simon originally trained as a conservator before moving into wider collections management and leadership roles in local authority and trust museums. He is a keen advocate of public engagement, particularly around bridging arts, humanities and sciences. He was the lead for Birmingham on the Staffordshire Hoard project that broke new ground in communicating conservation and research in UK archaeology, and was a member of the advisory group of the AHRC EPSRC funded Science and Heritage Research Programme. His research interests include ethics, cultural value and iconoclasm, and he participated in the AHRC-funded Iconoclasms Network and co-authored a chapter in the resulting publication, Striking Images, Iconoclasms, Past and Present. Over to you, Simon.
Thank you very much, mate. Good evening, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. May's already mentioned Nigel, and I did know Nigel, not very well, but I met him quite a few times, and it's a real honour to be able to deliver this lecture in his name, and I do think he would have enjoyed it. So, to give you an idea of this evening's structure, I thought it would be interesting to review the meeting that we went to, Conservation and Future Challenges, in 1998. And if you look online, you won't find it because the internet was still quite young. But I do have a copy here, so if you want to have a look afterwards, you're more than welcome. So what I thought I would do is set up something about the context of 1998, what the world looked like, review what we did and what we discussed within the context of that meeting. Then I want to reflect on some of the personal projects that I've been involved with, and kind of reflect on how they influence, how this meeting continued to influence the choices and decisions that I made, and then think about how did we do. So a bit of marking of the homework. We set out some challenges, we set out some aims, and look at how we did, and then think about what the future are. These fit for future challenges as well. So we're going to take about 45 minutes or thereabouts. But this is a very personal journey. So as May said, I started out as an apprentice at Hampshire County Council Museum Service. I was about 18 years old when this picture was taken. So I've been immersed in collections and museums all of my adult life, really. I was raised on a rather antiquated farm, so I was always surrounded by old stuff, so I don't have to feel for it. This is a 1905 economic task and economic attraction engine. I was one of the team that restored it, and you can see Flag on the Go, which wouldn't care, of course, because it is the 80s. So, I found in 1998, I got myself invited somehow to this meeting at West Dean College, and it was quite a profound experience, actually. It was set up by Laura Drysdale of English Heritage. A mentor of mine, Kate Bowler, was also involved, and a dozen of us, we were called committed, what was the word I wrote to them? Committed individuals, that's what we were called, were invited to think about the future of conservation and the challenges that it faced. And these are they, the Rose Gallery. So we have Jim McGreevy, now Director of Northern Ireland Museums, Jonathan Ashley Smith, who's with us tonight in the audience, then at the V&A, May Kassar, very in the corner, Kate Foley, my own mentor. I studied under Kate at Lincoln College of Art and Design, and she was a big influence. Sarah Staniforth, English Heritage, National Trust, Spike Bucklow from Hamilton Kerr, David Lee, former Director at West Dean, Chair of UK Institute for Conservation, and then ICON. Laura herself, Laura Drysdale, who's working at EH at the time, there's me, I get the best picture of course, Jane Henderson, Cardiff University, Andrew Oddie, then Head of Conservation for British Museum, and Ilva Dan show she was then. Where is Ilva now? I can't remember. She is at the National Trust of Scotland. Yeah, okay. So nearly all of these people I've continued to work with throughout my working life. Most of them are still in conservation. Laura's gone into some kind of consultation training business, and a few have retired, but they retain an interest, I would say. It was facilitated by a chap called George Walensky, who me and May continue to work with to this day, and George has made a significant contribution to our sector as a consultant, but he's an amazing man, a small company, and basically what he does is curates conversations. Really a top man to work with. We also had some guest speakers, so joining us for our two-day kind of retreat was Stephen Bailey, who was then a consultant, but he set up the Powerhouse Museum and the subsequent Design Museum, came from the V&A, and is a commentator on culture and design. We had Jetta Sandvall from the National Museums of Denmark, and we had Louise Smith from the MDA, which was the Museums Documentations Association, now the Collections Trust. It was the precursor to that Collections Trust. Okay, so the context of 1998, what was happening then? So opal fruits became starbursts. All downhill from there for me, basically. It was obviously pre-millennial dome. Millennial dome was just starting. There was all the fuss about the Y2K. We were pre-Euro, and the Verve, the music was in a pretty bad way. The Verve released Urban Hymns, which was a high point in a rather dismal year for music. Google didn't exist, so it was founded in this year without Google. The iPhone was some way away, and we were just seeing the introduction of BlackBerry, so information technology was just in its infancy, really, and I think it was reflected in some of our thinking. We had New Labour, of course, really developing its approach, and Test Match Special ceased to be on BBC television, so we lost cricket to Sky TV, which was a bad guarantee. But perhaps more importantly, we were in a post-Cold War situation, and we were optimistic perhaps about the future. And if we think about what writing was around at the time, Fukuyama had published The End of History, where he sort of proposed that we were moving to a new phase where democratic government will be the new model, and he subsequently has been some rethinking around this, but he was seeing a very bright future. And on the other hand, we had Huntington, the American, as well, American author, talking about the end of civilization, so predicting the rise of Islam, the clash of cultures and cultural conflict into the future. But I think, broadly speaking, we were quite optimistic about the future generally, but perhaps not so optimistic about the future of conservation. So we were asked to prepare a personal statement before we went, and these were shared, and amazingly I managed to find my personal statement, so I'm going to read it to you. We were asked a question: what are the driving external forces which will affect what we do in the foreseeable future, how we might plan, and how might we plan to deal with them? So my statement was as follows: my personal realisation is that the issues of access and accountability are the significant future challenges for conservation professionals. The idea that we must create wider access to the collections and information we manage is not new, but the conservation profession has been slow to realise this role. We must make ourselves more accountable in how we are managing both capital and cultural resources. There is a growing interest in how and why we make decisions, as well as how much they cost. I'm going to cringe when I read this, but the tenets of my personal philosophy are communication, promotion and empowerment. They're all right. My strategy is to establish conservation as a core issue central to the mission of my organisation. These are the tools I'm using to create a cultural awareness and ownership across the museums, staff, through training and promotion of the department's work. I'm also utilising new technologies that allow me to consider alternative approaches to object care and access. I see the role of conservation as that of a facilitator, building bridges between objects and people, adding value to their interaction with and understanding of history. So there you go, that's what I wrote. And I think, reflecting on that, I've been pretty consistent in my own writing around those themes. Those core themes that I mentioned there around accessibility, engagement, empowerment, are all things that I've continued to work through my career. So, what did we? So, in summarising the issues within the publication, I'm going to run you through these. So, in the publication, there's a summary of the issues that all of the attendees brought to the table. So, the first was clarity of mission, the importance to the heritage, the importance of conservation to the heritage industry, enhancement of the quality of life, so understanding that conservation has a role to play there, the contribution to a civil society. So this is the idea of a societal impact of conservation and be part of the sustainability debate. It might seem odd that we were just starting to be part of that debate, but we really were just beginning to grapple with the impact of climate change. We talked about the confidence in our role, say what we are, not what we are not, a bridge between objects and people, communicate, empower and negotiate, the application of science and technical understanding of material culture, and our potential as leaders, managers, and team members. And the leadership question came up quite a lot through discussions. There was this real anxiety that conservators particularly were not going into leadership positions, and that could still be the case, or not the case, depending on how we can maybe discuss that later. But there was definitely some anxiety about where we were as a profession and need to grasp these opportunities to lead as well as manage. So, becoming a profession, we predated ICON, predated accreditation even. So we were talking about strong standards for a strong profession, training, manual skills with a wide intellectual perspective. This constant tension between the need to be a strong intellectual framework for conservation as an area of discursive debate and discussion, but also the need for practical hand skills. We need to be able to engage with objects successfully, and of course accreditation and acknowledging private and institutional ownership. So accreditation was just around the corner, in fact, when we met. The idea of correcting national frameworks, one strong national voice, access to decision makers, and a national strategic framework. So again, we were concerned that conservators weren't engaging or weren't being allowed to engage and influence the decision makers around the debate. And the role of information technology. You'll note we only have one bullet point here. So it probably reflects where we were really. So I think many of us carried mobile phones even in 1998. So it's a creative tool worth major investment or just a representation of the real thing. So our anxiety here was that the idea that the digital could replace the physical, that's what we were concerned with. We weren't really thinking about how ICT could enhance the work that we do, be used as a communication tool, and indeed be used in research. And we talked, to give you a sense of it, how suspicious we were. It was described as a powerful genie that had been let out of the bottle, which I think, again, suggests some anxiety around that idea. So we came together, and did we make this leap of faith? I had never been to a meeting like this before, so I had been in the sector quite a long time. I was in my 30s, but I'd never attended a meeting like this. I've been to lots of conferences, but I'd not been to something where there was a workshop that was open discussion, discursive, and it was a really new experience. I was quite apprehensive about it, nervous, but actually I really, really enjoyed the experience, and it's a model that I still think works very successfully today and is very common. But at that time, for this sector, this was a very new approach. So, but we came together and we made this leap of faith. This is obviously a fake picture, but it's a performance artist from the 1960s. I forget his name. There you go. Thank you very much. So, what did we come up with? So I thought setting you the context, that's what we were worried about, but we had to come up with something. So through these 2 days, 2.5 days, we said, right, we're going to come up with a set of aims and strategies, and there's also an action plan. So I'm going to talk to you about those aims and strategies that we came up with. So the first was clarity of mission, a clear mission for conservation, enhancing the quality of life through the preservation of cultural heritage. And you can see we developed a strategy that went with that, to set conservation in its broadest, I thought I'd fix that typo, in its broadest context, and send it to colleagues, policy makers, wider public. Become more assertive in decision-making forums, learn from other successful lobbyists. So we were very concerned that other people had been much more successful than we were, working in a more integrated way to become a voice of sustainable solutions. promote pleasure in objects. This was really important. One of the things we discussed, particularly with Jetta Sambal and with Stephen Bailey, they talked about this concept of conservators having carnal knowledge of objects, which I thought was really lovely, a very scrumptious kind of idea. And also Stephen Bailey described us as kind of priests at the altar, with their, I think he talked about our potions and lotions and anointing these objects. And it's something that I've returned to, and in fact the last chapter I did with Jonathan on iconoclasm, I kind of referred back to that experience. But this idea of pleasure in objects was really important. We're all people that work with objects. We loved objects, and we still do. So we thought it was really important to highlight that. Confidence in our role. Quite clearly, it creates a strong profession, a professional conservation community which is confident in its role, critical, and has mature intellectual skills. So clearly we were concerned perhaps the conservation debate was rather too narrow. My own views are that we're very technocratic, that we weren't mature in terms of our intellectual approach. But we should also celebrate our own skills, recognise our potential to add value, and to work with others, support and foster scientific and humanistic base for our discipline, to recognise and promote the value, requiring more people with communication skills. So there was a sense that conservators were very much focused on objects. They were shut away in spaces and weren't really communicating effectively. And there were some notable exceptions. Around this time, the National Museums Centre in Liverpool, Conservation Centre in Liverpool, had opened and indeed won international awards and plaudits. So there was a shift going on in how we communicated. Becoming professional, one strong professional body speaking with one voice. This was a very simple aim. This was really about us saying we are a fragmented profession, and there's a number of different organisations representing the sector, and we should come together in one voice, and also find a voice in continental Europe and global issues, more of which later. We talked about education and training for conservators, which is rigorous and creative, but also prepares students realistically for entry into the profession. As professionals, support the development of the discipline through schools, mentor new graduates, lobby for funded internships. As employers, make our requirements known through dialogue with schools. As educators, foster the research and development of the conservation discipline. But clearly, we were seeing that there was potentially a disjoint between employers and employees moving, and I particularly remember this tension about student conservators moving into this space between employment and learning and education. There were some tensions there, and internship was very much seen as a solution to that. Conservation research, recognition and funding for applied scientific and humanities research as the foundation of our discipline. So again, this idea that we needed to really create a solid foundation for research for us to build upon. Persuade policymakers that conservation research brings added value to the heritage. And needs its own strategy and structure within or outside the research councils. Interesting. Encourage both strategic and informal research between public and private institutions. Publicise the added value of our intimate knowledge as educators, teach research methodologies as employers, reward it, stop regarding research as an added extra. And I bet there are quite a few colleagues working out there in institutions who are still struggling with this one, I suspect. So I think this boiled down to three areas for me following our discussion, the three spheres of influence that we were thinking about. There was the professional sphere, as practitioners of our skills, knowledge and understanding. So these were probably things that were within our immediate influence and to some degree our control, that we could go away and influence. There was also the public area, growing interest. I mean, how do we reach out to the public, the owners of the heritage? I take a rather Buddhist view that everything belongs to everybody ultimately. Possessions are only with us for a period of time and then we're going to somebody else. So it's about memory and identity. And then also the political, perhaps this is the most difficult piece, policymakers who are really interested in societal, social and economic impact. So those were the three spheres of influence which we'll come back to towards the end of the presentation. But Kate was very eloquent, and Kate is actually, she's retired now, but she writes poetry, very well-renowned poet actually, and she wrote this quote in the book, in the publication, which I use often actually, which is we must refresh our sense of mission, this idea that we have a mission and we should really, it's a call to arms if you like for me, be unapologetic both about the importance of conservation to a fragile heritage. Struggled always, for a long time I struggled with that idea of a fragile heritage, but again I'll come back to that later. and about its wider and social contributions to the quality of life and the maintenance of a civil society. So I often use this one because I think it beautifully encompasses, the power of conservation, its potential. So I'm going to move on, and I'm going to look at some projects that I was involved with that affected, influenced my thinking, some before and some after. So I was developed this exhibition with my colleague Mary Brooks, who's now at Dundee, Durham University, formerly the Textile Conservation Centre, and it's called Stop the Rot. It was at York Castle Museum. So why was it, this, we might look at this now and think, well, it's not particularly radical, you did an exhibition about conservation. Well, nobody had really done it on this scale. It was a large-scale exhibition. It was in the main body of the museum, or just a little showcase. And we completely, for me, it was an epiphany for both of us, because we kind of deconstructed what we did, but we asked three questions. We said, what are things made of? Why do they fall to bits? And what do we do about it? Fundamentally, most conservation exhibitions still follow that broad pattern. It was very successful, it was very popular. We put unconserved objects on display, which felt terribly risky at the time. But what we found was there was a fascination from the public. Aesthetic ruination seems to be something that people like, has an air of authenticity. And we took people on a journey, the conservators' journey, understanding the materials, so the synthetic versus the non-synthetic, where do they come from, how do they wear out, and then what did conservators do about that? So we did a number of things where we conserved half an object. It was the Daz washes white to challenge, where half the object's been cleaned apart. It was very effective, and I learned a lot from this. It was an award, it won the first Keck Award, IIC Keck Award for conservation, for communicating conservation, and it was a real turning point for me because it made me reevaluate my own understanding as a conservator, and really I felt that bench conservation probably wasn't for me at this point in my career. I needed to have a wider influence. It felt like I was, when I was dealing with a single object, there was hundreds of thousands of objects in the store rotting slowly away. I could hear them from my lab. So it was a very, very important event. And so this was pre-Conservation Future Challenges, and probably one of the reasons I was invited to join that discussion. I was then moved to the Museums of Science and Industry in Manchester, where I was moved into collections management role. And so this was a large industrial collection based in Manchester, and we decided, I ended up leading up a project there, which was the Collection Centre, about £1 million project, where we put collections front and centre. But what I did when I was there was I developed a training programme where I engaged the whole of the museum, absolutely everybody across the museum, in a programme about understanding objects and conservation and decay, based around the 9 or the 10 agents of decay. And this was pretty radical stuff at the time. We gave people objects to handle, and we engaged them in the process. And we were really successful in selling, taking those principles from Future Challenges about selling conservation, communicating the importance of conservation. And in the collection centre, we put collections in the heart of the museum. So we took collections that had previously been badly cared for, badly managed, and we put them into fresh spaces that the public could access. And so what we did was create access into these collections, and quite simply, if we put collections in these environments, they're more likely to be better cared for. So if you put stuff on public, if it's hidden away, you can take all sorts of liberties. If you put collections out in the domain, they will generally be better managed and better cared for. And I've been back and visited this fairly recently, and I have to say I do think it's a test of time quite well, even if I do say so myself. And it has been emulated and much improved by many other projects around the world. There's one recently opened in America, Landscapes, this idea of putting objects on display on a large scale. Where it fell down as a project was that the information technology to go with the display wasn't there. So actually finding stuff was much harder for the average member of the public. But it did have this lovely feel of serendipity about it. So it was really, you could just go through and find weird, wonderful objects. But it was a really interesting project, and I got a huge amount out of it. The next one I wanted to talk about is a project that I only touched upon, very briefly actually. This is Donald Campbell, for those of you who don't know. Donald Campbell and his father were rather well-to-do gentlemen who broke land speed and water speed records. So they had this kind of in the 60s, 50s and 60s. And he's pictured here on K7. So this was a jet-powered boat, I guess you would call it. I think that's the right term, K7. And this is on Coniston Water, where in 1967 he made an attempt on the water speed record. And what happened was this: about 300 miles an hour, he lost control, the boat flipped up in the air, and then bang, went down and sunk. Never to be seen, well, he was never to be seen again much later. What was remarkable about this, it happened live on national television, so this actually, the world was watching when this happened. And it's quite a remarkable bit of footage to watch. They have the recording of Campbell as well when this happened. So after the accident happened, Navy divers went in. They discovered the wreck, but they couldn't find his body, so they left it alone and treated it. And his family, in particular, wanted to treat it as a grave, and it was left alone. Roll forward into about 2004. A chap called Bill Smith from Newcastle was a diver. He decided that he wanted to recover it, negotiate with the family, and located the wreck, and indeed recovered what was left of Bluebird. And there's quite a lot of it left. The shower, I'm looking what the floaty bit's called.
Pontoons.
Pontoons, yeah. So they were gone, but the rest of it was there. And they did actually recover his body as well subsequently. But it caused all sorts of problems with families. His sister was adamant that she should be left alone. So it was already quite controversial. And I got involved because I was asked to go up and advise them on what they might do for the future of this object. So Bill's a really strong character. Bill Smith is a Geordie guy, runs a very successful business firm. He was obsessed with this project. And I went up to a meeting up in the Lake District. I was sat in the car park waiting to go into this meeting, just gathering my thoughts, and there was a tap on the window, and it was Gina Campbell, who was Donald Campbell's daughter. So she was very young when he died. She said, "Who are you?" So I had to tell her why I was there. And she said, "Well, you know we're going to put it back in the water, don't you?" And I said, "Well, I'm here to have the discussion." So I ended up having this discussion, and what was really clear was that this group of people didn't really want to have a discussion with us. Because my own view was very strongly that actually the right thing to do was probably not to restore it to working order, which is what they wanted to do. But Gina's view particularly was that she wasn't going to have this as a monument to her father's failure. It was the first time in my life I really dealt with somebody who had a direct connection to an object of this kind. And it was quite a powerful argument. The key thing was, though, they were asking for Heritage Lottery, they were thinking about asking for Heritage Lottery Fund support, and that was going to be problematic in and of itself, because is it something the Heritage Lottery Fund wants to support? Anyway, it was a very complicated project. We invited Bill. I was chair of the Icons Method section at the time. We invited Bill along to present the paper. We ran a number of conferences called Heavy Metal. We held one in Newcastle, especially so Bill could come along and join in and meet the conservation community and perhaps engage in the debate. And he came to his paper and then left immediately afterwards because he didn't really want to know. And the project, subsequently, I think they run the boat on the water, but it didn't work very well, so I think they're going back and doing some work on it. And it's privately owned and there are all sorts of family matters going on. But in terms of, it's an odd one, because it's like a repatriation of an object almost, but it just shows you the human aspect of dealing with an object of really significant material interest. I still think, there was my own view that there was a halfway house for this, that some level of clear reconstruction could have been done, that had been sympathetic, that would have, for me, have exemplified the bravery of Donald Campbell, who was a bit of a cad, by all accounts, and subsequently his body was also recovered and buried as well. I think there would have been a middle ground, but it was an interesting project, and I got one of the first times I dealt with a very aggressive disagreement about what I thought was right and what I thought was wrong in terms of ethical conservation practice. I'm going to touch very briefly on the project Renaissance at Work. When I was working in Birmingham, MLA, Museums and Libraries Archives Council, developed a project called Renaissance in the Regions, and this was to fund regional museums. Largely, it was education at the time, so most of it was around developing education. They were also very interested in diversity development. So I managed to wheedle some money out to do conservation and collections training. So what we did was we took training out to the regions, and we employed conservators, and paid them really well. Jonathan and a few other people in this room contributed to this programme. And we said, right, we're going to share our skills. So A lot of conservators, not up to this point, but there have been a reluctance for conservators to share their skills. So they're basically saying, well, if we share our skills with these people, they won't need us, they won't use us. Well, my argument was, not going to use you anyway because they can't afford you, because you're too expensive. Surely our responsibility is to the wider heritage, and that we need to work with volunteers and smaller organisations. And that's exactly what we did. We put together a programme that was very, very successful. We reached over 90% of the museums in the Midlands. We trained a few thousand, 3,500, 4,000 people over the period. What I learned from this project was don't build, have to be careful what you build your projects on, because basically the funding, the change of the direction of government funding, and it was just withdrawn. And what we hadn't done was build sustainability into the project and thought about how it might have a life beyond the funding cycle. It sounds quite naive now, but at the time, the government was saying this is long-term funding. We were told this was long-term funding, and then they subsequently decided that it wasn't long-term funding, it was project funding. But there are still some very strong legacies from this, and we've engaged a lot of people in the process. And we took a modular approach, so we kind of did a basic 10 agents, and then we built on that and did specialist work around pests, ethics and so forth. But we also did a lot of work around risk, and this was one of the outcomes, it was the wrapped risk awareness profiling into the project, and Jonathan here in the audience, Sharon here in the audience, helped out with this. A whole group of people came together because we realised that risk was really a big issue, so we could deal with a lot, we could actually approach collections, conservation from a broader macro point of view. We could take a view that if we identified what those key, what the assets were, what systems we had in place, what the financial structures were like, and understanding audiences, that we could create a tool that would help people manage their risks more effectively. It's still live as a tool. If you go to www.wrappedonline.org.uk, you can still use it. And what this starts to do, and I'm thinking about this ICT piece, is this starts to gather information, and it's recommended in the museum's accreditation standard that you use this. It gives you two things. It gives you a snapshot of your risk awareness, which is okay, but more importantly, it gives you access to lots of links to information about risk management. And so, looking at are you in a floodplain, looking at hazards in your collections, and then behind it, it's gathering information about the institution. So what this is actually doing is providing a map of risk across the UK for those participating institutions. And if we had a government that were interested, it could be actually really useful in thinking about where they might put funding in the future. They've chosen not to show much interest in it, but I still hold out hope that it could get there one day. But it's still there, it's still being used. How many, Sharon, do you know how many people have signed up, institutions have signed up for it?
No, but we do know that it's being used worldwide.
Well, so we've got some global interest.
And we're still gathering data on reports.
So this is that point about communication, ICT, broader, the macro view of heritage and conservation. Talk about Staffordshire Hoard, how could I not? So every once in a while in your career, a project might come along that's good. I was very lucky to be in Birmingham in July 2009 because a man had gone into a field in Staffordshire with a metal detector and he'd gone beep and he'd dug a hole and he found the most amazing find. I'm not going to say too much about the Staffordshire Hoard itself because you will already know. It is the largest find of Anglo-Saxon gold ever found. It went one fell swoop, it doubled the amount of Anglo-Saxon gold in existence to give you a sense of the scale of the find. It was phenomenal. I got an email from a colleague who was the Ultimate Antiquities Finds Liaison Officer, a guy called Duncan Slark. And Duncan's email simply said, Simon, there's been quite an interesting, significant find. I need to organise some transport and insurance to the British Museum. Piqued my interest. So I said, okay, I'll come down and we can have a look. And I'll never forget the moment I opened this Tupperware box to the Staffordshire Hoard across the bits, and it was, I don't know if any of you know the film Pulp Fiction, where Samuel L. Jackson opens the case and there's this golden glow that comes out of it. It was a bit like that. And there and then, I made the decision it wasn't going nowhere, it was going to stay right here. But what's really interesting about the find, of course, that it was found by a member of the public, it wasn't found by a professional. So this starts to move us to this idea of, well, there's societal impact, citizen science. These are people participating in archaeology who aren't archaeologists really. So there's a really interesting perspective. And I know, I mean, this has been the subject of a lecture here before, I think, for this evening. So I'm not going to talk about the technical aspect. I'm going to talk about what it felt like to be in the middle of the eye of this storm, because this was probably the most challenging and rewarding and awful and best project that I've to be in the eye of this storm. So when we start to think about that point about social and economic value, those political factors, when you're involved with a find like this, you then start to understand what politicians are about, really understand what they're about. So just a rogues gallery here. This man, Ian somebody or other, I've forgotten his name, but he was a regional minister. We don't have him anymore, but this was under New Labour. That's David Lammy, still Tottenham, I think he's representing Tottenham, good MP. Gordon, and there's Ed, or Daisy, Pope, previous Pope. So we got a phone call from the Vatican. You know you're in serious trouble when the Vatican phone you up. It's my former director, Rita, that's Kevin Lee, Roger, thank you, Roger Bland, how could I forget? Leader of Birmingham Council, leader of Staffordshire Council. The leader of Staffordshire Council, and this is very absolute God's honest truth, suggested that he should use the Staffordshire County Council pension fund to buy the hall for the county. Seriously. And you're all familiar with Lord of the Rings and the precious thing. Well, this is what this project was like. It was palpable, the greed around this project. But what was really clear, though, was it meant a lot to the people of the region. So we kept it under wraps, and then we released the information. And it turned out to be the largest and most successful public fundraising that the Art Fund had ever done. It raised £1 million of public money towards the 3.285 million purchase. And what became really clear was that there was just an incredible level of interest. So when it went live, the project actually went live, so we knew it was coming. Very few staff in the museum knew it was there, so even my PA at the time didn't know about it, so we kept it very, very quiet. The night that we announced the press release went out, I was down in London that evening, the evening before, and it was announced at 6 o'clock in the morning, and I was staying at a friend's flat, and I turned the news on, I'll never forget, it was just wall to wall. The Staffordshire Hoard was just wall to wall coverage. And we put a little showcase out with about 6 pieces, and I phoned my colleague that literally as soon as it 7 o'clock and said, I think you're going to have to get some more stuff out. It's very difficult to describe if you've never been in the eye of a media storm, but it is an incredible place to be. Stressful. That's me on Jacqueline's television, was a Chinese television, I'm sure. Jobless Man, finds ancient gold and silver. The world turned up at our door. And then we put it on display, and 40,000 people turned up in 2 weeks. We were completely unprepared for the level of interest. But it was this idea that this was our find, this was a find for the West Midlands and for Staffordshire. And we really took our lead from that. We realised that there needed to be, this had to stay in the region. So from that point forward, we were going to campaign to do that. The British Museum, some people have been castigated by some people who didn't know what was going on. The British Museum never showed any interest in acquisition. They always saw themselves as the last resort. They wanted it to stay in the regions and were very supportive. But what we did cook up was a joint ownership programme. So the Staffordshire Hoard is owned jointly by Birmingham and Stoke-on-Trent Museums, Stoke-on-Trent County Council. So Birmingham City Council and Stoke-on-Trent jointly own it. We don't own half each, they don't own half each, they own the whole thing. This is apparently a good thing. So I was listening to my former colleague, Dr. Ellen McAdam, on Radio 4 this week. She was on Monday. I don't know if anybody caught, there was a programme looking at why bother with museums, kind of thing, looking at museums. And she described this as a good partnership. She was questioning herself, was this a good thing, sharing objects? And she hasn't got a choice but to say, yes, it's a good thing. And I don't work here anymore, so I can say what I think. I think it's a terrible idea. I think in principle, it sounds great. Let's share it. What it does is double cost. It doubles complication. You enter extended legal agreements. It's a massively complicated thing to do. And my own view is that dual ownership is not the way to do it. I think if it had been acquired by Birmingham, Birmingham would have been generous in its management of the material. But it was a politically driven decision to do it. And all it's done is cost both cities, you double up cost and everything. So each one's holding an inventory, each one has to share photograph. It's just incredibly complicated. Everything gets really complicated. So my own view is, occasionally, and also puts the collections at risk. You end up moving collections around more than you probably would otherwise. There was significant doubt cast on our ability to deliver a conservation project. So we had some interesting conversations. Anglo-Saxon archaeology seems to be a particular space to be in. I think there's a corner of hell specially reserved for it was difficult, really, really difficult, and career threatening. I have people, absolute direct threats to me, like, you will never work again, etc., etc., etc. And that's what I mean when it was saying it's really tough to deal with. But we held our nerve and we said we are going to keep this in the public eye. So we made sure that the conservation project was out there, and we built a community of interest. And we toured it, and we sent it, for instance, to the cathedral in Lichfield. So Lichfield, Anglo-Saxon centre, Mercia. And I had colleagues, serious colleagues, saying, you can't put it on display in the cathedral. That's, you know, the cathedral are secure, cathedral for this, or environment's wrong, or whatever. There was a real objection. But when we put it in the chapter house, I said it absolutely, this comes down to pure joy of object. I was thrilled to see it there, so it was a great thing to do. And we toured around the whole region. It's been the saviour for 2 museums, that's for sure. It's an amazing project, and continues to be an amazing project. But we worked hard from day one. We said it would be open, and we have blogged. Everybody who's been involved with it has to blog, and we've made it an open process. And you know, we're all getting quite awards this year. Thank you very much. So that was nice to get that acknowledgement. And long may it go on this work. So that's what I'm saying. That's not sure. And the other thing, you get to take pictures of Anglo-Saxons when you go on microscope. So interestingly, this chap's called Wayland Lord Badger. He's a reenactor, and he's become a firm friend through this project. I mean, he knows much more about Anglo-Saxon England than I ever will. Amazing guy, he does this reenactment stuff, and we're now firm friends, and through Facebook, we have conversations, so it's amazing where you go with some of these projects. Okay, so let's have a quick review. So these are the 12 good and true who came up with those ideas, that vision. How did they do? So we talked about one profession, professional body speaking with one voice. I've already read the blurb. So what happened? So we had convergence. I found this slide. So this slide is from the original Convergence Roadshow. So many of us went out and we actively supported convergence because it wasn't a given. There were members of each area of professional body who were not necessarily with it, but we had to say it's good for the cultural heritage, it's good for conservation, it's good for the profession, it's good for the individual member. We probably should have added in also it's good for the public as well, but there we go. Put aside our factual interests, see that bigger picture, etc., etc. So we went out there and we walked the walk, so we actively said, okay, we're going to do something about this. And the icon was created. I'm lucky enough to be a former chair, icon, which I really enjoyed. And it's gone on to be a stable and successful organisation. Always a challenge running a membership organisation, and we can come on to that here under the discussions. So we talked about conservation research and recognition and funding for applied scientific humanities research at the foundation of our discipline. So I think that we moved on in terms of research. Again, I liked Jonathan, but we've had some great publications. Conservation Principles came out. Our thinking has moved on. We have codes of practice. We've moved on from reversibility. I think we're much more fit for purpose than we were previously. And also, we've seen the founding of the National Heritage Science Forum. So, living proof that we're developing networks and frameworks that are helping to inform policy. And also, English Heritage released its research strategy. Obviously, I'm not sure what the status of this is. It's now whether this sits with English Heritage or Heritage England, as they are. Historic England. But actually, a piece of consultation work. They actively engaged cultural institutions and research councils in the formation of this strategy, which I think it's the first time that had ever been done in this context. Whilst there isn't a national strategy, there is one from the key national organisation. Influence in the future, about confidence in our role, a strong professional conservation community with confidence in its role, critical and mature intellectual skills. So this from 2000, which talks about conservation being framed as a social activity, and also a technical one, bound up with the shaped by myriad social processes. Must integrate the assessment of cultural significance and its work and more effectively facilitate negotiations and broader the cultural heritage of conservation to play a productive role in the civil society. So the discourse around conservation is developing. We're starting to see ourselves in that broader context. We're starting to see ourselves outside of the laboratory. We're starting to see ourselves making that contribution to the civil society. And it's really important because actually we bring people close to objects through the communication that we do. And there's been some great stuff. This is a workshop we did in Birmingham, and here's one at CSI Sitting Room. There are lots of examples. It's a much more confident sector. There's loads and loads of really high quality engagement work going on in the conservation sector, which is amazing. It's become the norm. And I know that it's taught more in programs, but there is much more desire for conservators, in my view, to go out there and engage with people and do it really well. CSI is a great example of that. And here's one of our own from UCL. This is Jane Humphreys, who won our Public Engager of the Year award last week. And Jane is doing work in Sudan, so she's going out and working with communities in Sudan and engaging them with the archaeology around them. This is an amazing project. I mean, I can't even begin to describe how complicated this project is and the work she's had to do. But what she's doing is going and saying, look, this archaeology is around, this is where it comes from, this is what's important, and creating a sense of ownership around that archaeology, which I think is really, really important for reasons that we'll come to in a second. So we talked about influencing clarity of mission, a clear mission for conservation, enhancing the quality of life through preserving the cultural heritage. So, science and heritage reports. So this is probably the best example that I could find of how we might move that forward. And then May, who sat down there, was obviously a major mover and shaker behind that. But we also talked about promoting pleasure, that aim. And this is what we need to do. We need to promote pleasure in objects. We need to engage young people at an intimate level with objects. And this was there was a school in Birmingham who won a competition that we ran to have a day in conservation. We got up close and personal with mums, and it was just chaos. It was chaos, but it was brilliant. And for me, it's about one person at a time, and that's how we change the world. Education and training. So we talked about the need for conservators, which is rigorous and creative, which is prepares students realistically. So I think that the CHAR, obviously I'm going to come go the logo, but the CHAR CDT program is a fantastic example of taking a really fresh and understanding a new paradigm for treatment of how we engage with the challenge of conserving cultural heritage in its broadest sense. So it's a great example there, and it's not the only one, but I think I certainly think it's setting a new standard. But I would say that. Okay. So, I think that we did quite well actually. I think if you look, and I was thinking when I was doing my research for this, I got distracted a lot. But I was thinking, is it glass half full or glass half empty? And I think we have made significant progress in the nearly 18 years, or whatever it is, 20 years since, 18 years since 1998. But what about the future challenges? So this is my own take, it's not a comprehensive list. The present and future challenges, technology. So it's about, there's a reducing cost and size in technology. So we're seeing technology is getting smaller and more transportable for conservators to use. Remote monitoring is a real opportunity for us, and that relates to ICT as well. We can remotely monitor the deterioration of things. And predictive and non-invasive techniques that we can use to solve this. So, digital disruption. So I mentioned that we had rather, in hindsight, like a naive approach to ICT, but we're now dealing with the born digital material. How do we deal with the preservation of born digital material? And also, how do we think about replication? I've just done a paper, finishing a paper with a colleague at Tate, looking at replication issues for Los Angeles IIC Los Angeles this summer, the IIC Congress Los Angeles. And I think it's really interesting that we're thrown up with what is the role of replication, particularly when we're thinking about contemporary art, which is much more ephemeral. National strategy for the protection of the movable heritage. We do not have a national strategy. We don't have any policy or standard really around the movable heritage. We have it for the buried heritage, we have it for the built heritage, but it doesn't kind of exist in the same way for the movable heritage. And I think that's a problem, and we don't have a national strategy for conservation. Standards and practice, increased professionalism and accountability. So conservators as a sector, we've always said we want to be taken seriously, we want to be professional. But if you're going to be professional, I think you need to prepare to be sued. So I think that's the measure of the profession, that when someone's going to say, actually, you are accountable, legally accountable for what you do. And so this is the point when you look at organisations with charter states, perhaps, you are accountable. If you build a bridge as an engineer and it fails, you're the person in the dock. And I think that we need to be prepared, as conservators need to be prepared to take that space. Environmental impact, increased damage to heritage. So we're seeing flooding and so forth, there's an increased risk to new challenges around that. We live in a post 9/11 7/7 world, and the impact of conflict and cultural difference, which I'm going to come on to in a second. But none of us in 1998 could have possibly imagined what's happening in the world today. I was just thinking, we'd seen the Balkans crisis and we'd seen some culture under attack in that. None of us, I think, can predict what's happening now. Austerity, and I'll talk here, I'm going to call it unintended consequences and resilience. So the impact of austerity cannot be underestimated. My view is that we will be feeling the effects of austerity on the preservation of collections in the next 50, 100 years. The damage that's being inflicted now will not realise itself in the short term. And one of the big problems is that we're living in a very short-term world. And Kate Foley picked this up in her notes in Conservation Future Challenges. The job of the conservators, sure, we're about creating access and allowing people to use objects and talk about object lifetimes. But ultimately, we should be thinking about longevity. And that's a real challenge. And this is a UK issue, but I also think austerity is a broad issue for us to think about. Public accountability and participation, so this is about profiling the citizen conservators. We need to be more open to the idea of community archaeology, getting people involved with what we do and not be afraid of that, and indeed we are doing that. Education and training, is there a skills deficit developing? There are certainly some areas of heritage conservation. I showed a picture of myself earlier with the steam engine. There's a lot of skills loss around heavy engineering, but also around early computing and the complexities of looking at the one down the list of the 21st century. Research, linking research councils, HEIs, cultural institutions and practitioners. I still think there's more to be done there. Conserving the 20th and 21st century, complexity and durability. You know, it's likely that something that was painted in the 16th century has got a lot more chance of being around in 100 years as something that's going to be painted next week. So we are dealing with much more complex environments, and durability, and indeed art design not to be durable. And then there's the profession itself, the demographics. What are the demographics of our profession? Are we recruiting enough people? Are we diverse enough? And fundamentally, are we sustainable? The numbers suggest we are. There had been very little movement in ICON's membership in 10 years. It's pretty stable, around 2,500 members. But there are somewhere around 21,000 people who identify themselves within the sector. So there is could be more talent. Right, I'm going to finish with just a few images and just a few thoughts. So I talked about technology, handheld technology. This is becoming more and more valuable. Obviously, this is a laser treatment. So this is from Birmingham. This sort of equipment is coming down in price all the time, becoming more and more available. That's an opportunity and a threat. We also have handheld devices like XRF. This is a handheld XRF measuring arsenic in a stuffed penguin. Yes, you do. The challenge here is training people to be able to gather the data and use it properly. So it's not just about having the kit, you need the brains to go with it. And they're non-invasive. So this is Dr. Heide Lang from Nottingham Trent University using optical tomography to non-invasive examination of paintings. So imagine if you're dealing with ceiling paintings and so forth, you don't need to build a scaffold anymore, you could do it from the ground. So there's all sorts of opportunities that are accruing there. Coming back to where, towards the beginning, those spheres of influence, I'm just going to touch on these very briefly on the political, public and professional through these next few slides. Cultural value has been the single biggest challenge, I think, that we face. Because value, the work of the conservator is ultimately connected to the value of the object, whether it be its financial value or its intrinsic cultural value. John Holden wrote extensively about this, as has Robert Hewison, and eloquently so. And John Holden came up with these remarks that we should see a forward-looking model assessing the raw public value or loss of value, promote a strong museum and conservation community confident in its worth, reflect, really echoing the points we made in Conservation Future Challenges. And he warned against, instead of weak culture dedicated to the production of ancillary benefits, this is where we end up pursuing government goals, if you like, local government goals, political goals, which actually are not doing, and ultimately are detrimental in my opinion. And challenge policymakers and cultural organisations and practitioners to adopt a new relationship, but we're still trying to do that. But this is the thing for me. It's about the intrinsic. This is an old argument about intrinsic and incremental. The intrinsic value of objects matters. Our experience with object matters. I didn't take this picture. I wish I had. This was taken by Dr. Elliot Hurwitz, who produces a fantastic book called Museum Watching, in which he takes surreptitious pictures of people in museums engaging with objects. And whilst he's touching it, that observation, you can see the revelry and the pleasure of the object here. And my own experience here, this is Koriyama in Japan. I took an exhibition when I was at Birmingham to Koriyama in Japan. It was a Burne-Jones exhibition that has a fantastic art gallery in Koriyama, otherwise an unremarkable city. I went for a cup of coffee while I was there, and sat down, and this gentleman came up to me and started to talk to me. He was about 80 years old. He was from Fukushima, and he'd been evicted from his home because of the meltdown of Fukushima. And he told me that he had in his kitchen, he'd been to see, he found out who I was, what I did. He'd been to the exhibition that we were there, because I was there bringing it back, and he bought a number of postcards and he put them in his kitchen above his sink. Because he was living in this very small apartment in this beautiful house with his garden, and he knew he was never going to go home again. He was right near the reactor. And for me, right there, right then, that's why we do, why do I do. You know, that his interaction with those objects. And he was so grateful to be able to have those moments in the gallery of the paintings. That's what matters to me. And so does this. This is a blind visitor in Birmingham. We did a mummy's day. Guy phoned in to be wanted to bring his wife. Could she touch the objects? Otherwise, I wouldn't bother. Well, I mean, we can argue about whether this is a sustainable thing to do, but for me, it felt sustainable for doing it for one day and giving her that opportunity. This woman lost her sight. She'd been sighted as a youngster and then regained lost her sight. And so it was just an amazing experience for her to do that. And so it was all managed. And lots of other people, lots of other public in the room didn't have a problem because we wouldn't let them touch, but we let her touch. So small differences. So thinking about the image that I used to promote this presentation, this talk, was this idea of this, I can't remember what it is, it's an Austin, Westminster sedan, and it's called a relic, and this is in Hue in Vietnam. So why this car is important? Well, what's interesting about it, I think, is a complex object structurally. There's lots of stuff going synthetic and non-synthetic. It's being stored in the open air and marine environment, etc., etc., etc. But why it's important is because that's it there. And it was the car that brought this Look, this monk, to immolate himself in 1963. An image that still shocks, I think. JFK apparently completely stopped in his tracks when he saw this. And I think this is one of our challenges in modern conservations, with the objects and images and the way they fit together are a real challenge for us to think about how we preserve and conserve. Amazing act that he undertook, and shocking is today. And I think what was shocking about this at the time, of course, that the American War in Vietnam was recorded in a way that the Second World War wasn't. So the kind of imagery that came out of that conflict set the tone really, and kind of had a shock value that I don't think you can appreciate. I think it's an incredible picture. And here, thinking about unintended consequences or intended consequences, this is a Buddhist temple in northern Laos that was bombed by the Americans when they were illegally bombing the Ho Chi Minh Trail after having agreed that they wouldn't bomb that area, the Geneva Convention and so forth. But the serious point here is that the Americans and the British signed up to the Geneva 54 Convention but didn't ratify it until very recently. And we're now in the second protocol because following the Balkans crisis there was a thought that actually cultural material would start to become targeted, and my God, didn't just. So we saw, first of all, the destruction of the Bamayan Buddhas, and there's a very good chapter in the book, the majority did our chapter in, on what happened around this, and I would really recommend it as a read to understand a bit more of the subtleties around why this was done. It doesn't justify it, but it just gives us a better understanding. So this was just pre-9/11, so this was, I think, what was the date there? That's March 2001. So September 2001, Twin Towers, etc. And then ultimately we end up where we are today with these shocking images of iconoclasm. And which are, what do we do about it? And my colleagues writing about this, and this is why this second protocol is so important, what kind of actions can we take? And I refer back to Jane Humphrey's work in Sudan. You know, perhaps one of the ways that we can engage with this is to engage with people before this stuff happens. I'm not saying it would work, but there's an interesting debate around this, but we have to remember that it's not solely an Islamic pastime. So the destruction of culture sometimes is allowed to happen in the Western world because this is good, because it's for a dictator. And more recently, we've had the Roseman's Fall debate. This is from a display at UCL. This is in, I think, this is University of Cape Town. Removal of the statue because we no longer live what it stands for. I'm not saying it's good or bad, I'm just saying that actually it's a much more complicated, and as conservators, we have to be engaged in the subtleties and the complexities of these debates. It's not black and white. And finally, talking about the fragility of heritage, Rothko was vandalised by Vladimir. But the point here is that the culture remains to be under threat. So I'm going to give you my last word, or not my last word, I'm going to come back to Kate, my mentor, and one of the reasons I'm standing in front of you today. And I've just slotted in, we must continuously refresh our sense of mission and be unapologetic about the importance of conservation to our heritage and about its wider social contributions to the quality of life and maintenance of the society. So I hope that's been helpful. It's been a very personal journey for me. There were many avenues I went off when I was writing, but thank you for listening, and we can move into the Q&A.
Very much, Simon, and I think we're going to generate an awful lot of questions, so I've got to try and see what we're going to do about this. I would like you please to give your name and your affiliation, no commentary, questions, because that way we get more people for the time we've got asking questions, and then the commentary can follow when we have drinks upstairs. Okay? Can we do that?
That sounds good.
Okay. So who's going to go first? Ooh, having said that, everybody's terrified. No hands in the air. It's Lois. Yes, please introduce yourself.
I'm Keith Webb. I'm one of the CHA students at the University of Maine. This is really no commentary.
Exactly.
Heritage science is considered a newer field. How can we look at this to start building what heritage is?
I think we are building. I think it's actively happening. So I think when I look at what the world looked like for conservators in 1998 to what it looks like now, it's a different picture. And I think the CHA CDT is an example of that, and the Heritage Science Forum is an example of that. So we change it by engaging people in the discourse and thinking about the discourse that we create and who we bring into that. So if we broaden, my own view is that the technical discourses are important, but the technocratic discourse is fundamentally self-limiting, so we need to broaden the discourse. And if it is technocratic, we need to show how it applies impacts of the world. So I think programs that we're engaged with and the way that we're thinking about the world has changed quite significantly. So we do it by doing it, is the simple answer.
And the work of heritage science is integral into conservation practice.
Yes.
Okay. One and then two.
So it seems like
Could you introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry, my name's Sarah. I'm with the UCL MSc program in conservation. It seems like the group that met in 1998 was very much a product of the 90s financial bubble. Do you think that the conservation profession was able to successfully adapt its delineated goals following the 2008 financial crisis with austerity cuts, closure of the livable sector, and
So the feeling at that meeting was not necessarily your view. The feeling was that the sector was not being funded in the way that it should be. In hindsight, it was better roses compared to where it was, frankly. So that certainly wasn't the feeling. My concern, and this is not really, I think that there's a kind of apartheid going on, and I choose that word carefully, and it's not just a London, a north-south, a London, not London divide. It's about how the national museums are funded and and money going into research and cultural institutions, and what is going on outside of those institutions for non-nationals. So I think that the ability to react effectively is restricted by the processes, the macroeconomics of what's going on around them. I think the sector's got better at communicating. Absolutely. I think that there's no lack of passion there. But my big concern is that the macroeconomic forces are so great and so outside of our control. It's very hard. We're not winning, broadly speaking, we're not winning the cultural value argument, and I certainly think we're struggling to win in terms of the heritage conservation.
Okay.
Does that answer?
Matthias Service, UCL Institute for Sustainable Heritage. Simon, do you think that there is a particular role that university museums can or should play?
Good question. Yes, I do. I think my own view on this, and I'm developing this at UCL, is that really the role of the University Museum has a number of things to do. In terms of this national picture, I think we should be test beds, we should be experimental places, we should be places where we can take risks and do things differently, and then share that, more importantly, engage with the wider communities, the cultural communities, and share that learning. But also we can be generous partners as well. So it's how do we develop programs where we can be generous partners to those people who may not have the learning resources that we have. But I think it's incumbent upon us to develop, challenge, and do things that universities should do, experiment, and then, because we can take risks that others can't, actually. But the important thing is how do we then share that. A good example, we've done some work recently here around object-based learning. We had a conference, we've done a lot of work around object-based learning, and a very high percentage of people coming into that conference were from museums from outside of London, trying to look at how that affected health and well-being. So thinking about how we engage. So yes, I think there's definitely a role for university museums. I don't think they all see it that way. There's a difference.
Thank you.
Simon,
Could you say
oh, excuse me, I'm so sorry. Alison Richmond from ICON.
Chief
Simon,
Executive of ICON, actually.
what can we do about leadership? Is it that people are not getting the top jobs from conservation because they're not confident enough to go for them, or do you think there's a glass ceiling for people who reach, just below the sort of top job in cultural organizations?
So I think my view in 1998 was that there was a glass ceiling. Now I'm standing here in a leadership role. And am I convinced? I think there are, we had a discussion about this the other day. I don't think there's enough evidence for me to suggest there is a ceiling. I think there are barriers to progress which are bigger. I think there are barriers around ethnicity, around gender, around social economic, as well as educational issues. I'm not convinced there is the evidence that there is an actual barrier. So I don't know the answer. Are conservators putting themselves forward for this kind of career development that allows them into the kind of leadership role or not? I think that's the question we need to answer or find some information around first. Are they applying to on programs and not getting selected, so things like full leadership? Or is it that they're simply not applying and there isn't an aspiration, and is that maybe because they see their sphere of influence relating to collections? Think about conservators specifically. So I don't know the answer. I think we need to look into a bit more. I'm not convinced there is a kind of a conspiracy against conservators. I'm not convinced of that. But there may be. That we're seeing as there's no reason. Let's put it clear. There is no reason why the conservation sector should not generate as many leaders as any other area of the cultural sector. So that's what I would answer.
Yeah, brilliant. A question or comment, please. Just a question. Introduce yourself, please.
Anna, I'm a PhD student at the UCL. How do we break the vicious circle between tokenistic policies and tokenistic actions that have to happen because otherwise we won't get to
I think that's a leadership question. So that is about the people leading cultural institutions need to take a look at the way that they are working and work harder at it. It's difficult. It is the environment outside, particularly with there's a large number of local authority museums or receiving funding from local and public sources. It's a brutal environment at the moment. It is absolutely brutal. And really difficult choices are being made, and that was really my comment about we're going to see the impact of the lack of investment. It's going to take a long time to recover, so we are going to see a real lag, I think, in terms of, and there's been some fantastic progress made in museums. So museums have invested consistently in the care of their collections and the management of their collections, improving access, improving education programs, and conservation professionals and heritage professionals have contributed to that, I think. I'm not sure what the answer is, because there isn't, it has to be about lobbying, and it has to be about rediscovering intrinsic value, the pleasure of objects, and saying that has value. And really good writers are doing this work, saying, Hewson's one, we're doing a lot of work here on health and well-being, saying, well, there are health and well-being benefits, and people who are engaging culturally are less likely to present symptoms to their GP around depression and related to personal health issues. So we just have to work hard on it. But it's a very difficult one, because I find it hard to see how that's likely to be broken, because I think there's a disingenuous debate going on at a national level. I was at an event recently, it's the George Osborne, so the Creative Industries Federation had a big bash at the old BBC studio. George Osborne spoke, he was the surprise speaker. He was absolutely brilliant at not that I support him, but he was absolutely brilliant. And he talked about the value of culture in an absolutely convincing way. Creativity and culture were top of his list, and it was absolutely proficient. And it's a disingenuous approach. I mean, it's very difficult to work around that. So I guess a way in, just thinking through, is how do we influence funders and policymakers, and that's looking at peers and research councils, and how that's the way into influence, I think, is the only way. Sorry, extended answer.
Yeah, okay. Sorry, Sarah again. Has there been a discussion of, I guess, advertising the scientific nature of conservation in early childhood education in order to combine STEM education and humanities studies together?
That's a really good question. I don't know is the answer. My suspicion is that the way that we're going about education now is it's much more stranded, so it's less happening less. But there is work going on, so lots of museums are doing work, not necessarily around conservation, but certainly around engaging schools with collections. I don't think material science is taught in the same way. There is an opportunity to do that. I'm not, to be honest, in my university. Maybe some of the back of the room.
Any other questions?
Catherine Curran from the Institute for Sustainable Heritage. Kind of related, just and also to do a question about conservators getting into leading roles. Do you think that's an education question as well, in terms of people being taught management skills or things like that as part of conservation education?
Yes, I also think it's an aspiration issue, so I think it's where being aspired to believe that you can, so not seeing anything as a barrier, well, that's not for me, but understanding that you can influence the world in a different way from your position of leadership and all the challenges that go with that. There are no clear, I mean, again, I did a lot of work early on around PACR, we talked about career escalators and things like this. It's very difficult, but I look at my own career, there's no logic to it, it's completely random in a sense, it's about taking opportunities. And I think that's true for the broader sector, there isn't a linear career path. You have to be prepared to move, and I don't think there will be a linear path, so I think it's about developing aspiration in young conservatives to do it, and to take on the challenge.
It's believing you can do it.
Yeah.
It's actually believing, not being satisfied with your basic training, that there is something beyond that. It's actually your core. It's what you train to do. But beyond that, if you are going to go further, you have to add experience, qualifications, leadership. It's all that accumulation that then takes you to different places.
I should have mentioned, I did mention it, mentoring is another area, is a really key area. Getting good mentors, right? So I became a great mentor for mine, I've had many good mentors, former and informal through my career, so that always helps.
Please.
Thinking about this, it links to pathways, firstly in biotic from Staffordshire Hoard, it links to pathways question and to heritage science question to ask for, is a future challenge to merge and bridge the gap between conservation and heritage studies. Heritage studies address all the complex issues that you highlighted which are critical for understanding heritage first. So do you kind of see this as a future challenge to bring the two together, getting these two together?
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I think it may be a natural evolution. There may be a natural evolution towards, but it's how do you know, creating programs that give people, like foundation. You can have a foundation project and you can take all options. But there are some critical issues in the practice of conservation, and a colleague in the audience is going to be talking about this in the summer at the ICON conference. This skill, what I was talking about skills deficit, you need to know when you're engaging with others, you do need to know what you're doing. So you can't just, it isn't all, it is science and understanding, but actually it comes down to touch. Actually, it's a really important part of it, and that's an ongoing challenge with what in bringing programs together. Can you, Kate in the publication talked about the cost of practical training. One of the things that drives practical space out of universities is it's expensive, so if you just teach it in the classroom, they will be high return. I guess, yes, I think, but there is a challenge there about how you then, what is the pathway?
Time for one last question, and then we can give Simon a drink, I think. Yes, at the back, thank you.
Graham Stevens, bluegreenuk.com. Geneticists are developing planning skills for mapping which species to allow to go extinct. Do you have a similar approach for evaluating which heritage you can let go and which is the key to save?
It's a really good idea. It's a great question, and the simple answer to that is no, we don't. I think that the ones that tend to die are the ones that simply there's a lack of interest. Or there was a presentation here a few weeks ago. The guys that did the computer, I forget the name, the SEAT. What's it called? SEAT computer.
So that was Anthony Herbert.
Yes. So there's a group of these guys who were a technician. EDSAC. And we did one in Manchester as well, the baby there. And these are the guys that built these machines, valve-driven, completely nothing like we imagine a computer now. But will their skills get passed on in such a way that anybody can do that in the future? No, I don't think they will. So I think there will be some form of natural selection rather than a selective process. I've seen the same thing happen in demonstrating textile machinery. So I used to work with two old guys who were fantastic sort of spinning mules, that kind of thing, carding machines. They could do everything. Both Lancashire born and bred. One was from Bolton, one was from Oldham, and that was like Mars and things. Really very funny guys to work with. But they knew the machines intimately. They'd grown up with them. They knew how they worked. And then when they retired, we brought in people to run those machines, and we did everything we could. We developed training programs. Everything we possibly could, but it just wasn't the same. We didn't have the same empathy with those machines, and we had all sorts of problems arising from the operators not having feel, not having hours under their hands. They couldn't handle the machine, just feel if it was right, if that belt was the right tension. So there's an element of self-selection, I think, that goes on there. And then perhaps sometimes, like Bill with the K7, they were trying to rebuild that. It's a really complex thing, and putting a rocket, modern. It was a vintage rocket engine into a vehicle with modern health and safety standards and all the things you can imagine would go with it. It was a real challenge for them to do. Bloody dangerous, actually. I won't go on this thing. I talked about aircraft preservation as well. And the risks of flying ancient vintage aircraft is another one as well. That's an interesting area. Because that usually involves death as well.
Simon, thank you very much. Very illuminating and really informative. Thank you.